Right now, however checked out you are, if someone across a noisy room said your name, you'd catch it instantly. And that's the tell. You're never not listening. You're always listening for the one thing that touches you, which means in every argument you've ever had, you were listening for something very precise. And it probably was not ever the truth that you were listening for. Every time I teach this, I get the same pushback. Isn't this just active listening? Isn't your listening framework just personal perception in different clothes? So I'm all for being skeptical, which is why in this episode, I'll turn over some of the core ideas of ontological coaching, which underpins the work that I do, and show you what's under them or how they work. And I'll do that in response to listener questions. If you haven't been around for the past 4 episodes, that's fine. This will be a kind of working summary, and then you can go back and get the details of those 4 episodes, which has been a series on language as a technology. And I'm not talking linguistics, but something more practical. How we humans live in a sea of language, how language gives us the power to create, a power that separates us from, say, animals, though you'd sometimes wonder. This is What to Believe, Finding Signal in the Noise. I'm Neil Beerbaum, a journalist turned master coach, reporting what I've found across 4 decades of investigating the bug in the human operating system, the one that makes it hard for us to face the truth about ourselves and leaves us believing things about ourselves and the world that aren't true. And by the way, I'm drawing from a field called linguistic ontology, which has been developed into a modality called ontological coaching, and I have my own version of that called effective inquiry, which is what I'm teaching you to do here. So let's get into it. The first question is in response to episode 8, which was all about language as a technology. And it goes like this. It says, your language as a technology piece is interesting, but what's the point? What am I supposed to be getting beyond the fact that we use language to explain things to each other and make things? Isn't the explaining and making of things the whole point? What does it matter that we achieve it using language? So this came up in a class that I gave recently, a lecture on ontological coaching for a master's class at a business school. And the question came up, and the feedback I got at the end of the day, the formal feedback that was submitted through the process, was that it was complicated to begin, but became very practical. Now, I didn't argue that with the people who are running the program because, okay, I'll take responsibility and I'll always try to make it less complicated. However, my honest view is that it was complicated because the students were overthinking it, which is natural. They were students. It was an academic environment. But in fact, we all do that, even when we're not students. And this points me back to my quote by Saul Bellow. Intellectual man had become an explaining creature. Man to his own soul explained. We've become overthinkers. And let me explain exactly what I mean by that. So we were conducting an inquiry, which is what we do in ontology. We ask a question like, as what does leadership exist is the question. And people then start throwing up all sorts of academic and intellectual ideas about it. But we're asking a question like, as what does it exist? The way that, say, a pen would exist as metal, or my finger exists as flesh. What is the material that we're working with? What is the material, the substance of leadership? And the answer, I'll give it to you directly, although what I should do is, what works better is that you do the inquiry yourself, is that it is conversations. It takes the form of conversations. It takes the form of language. And that's something to look at directly, to see, to observe. Now, what happened was, in the intellectualizing and the processing, they said it a few times, but they didn't stop at the point when they said, oh, it's conversations. And, when somebody can see something, then there's nothing more to say. You just see it. It's like, oh, yeah, oh, I get it. Then the conversation stops. They said it a few times and walked right past it. And so I would point out to them, I said, you guys have said it, you've landed on it, but you haven't recognized it as being the thing that we're looking for. So go back and look again. And I was trying to get them to look at the phenomenon directly, which in learning terms is what we call apprehending. So learning by experiencing, by doing, by seeing something directly is learning by apprehension or apprehending. And learning by understanding through a book is learning by comprehension. So if we were to go back to the old bicycle example, when you learn everything you need to know about bicycles through a book, well, that's comprehension. When you learn to ride a bicycle, balance, that's apprehension. Now, what we mostly do and what the students were doing on that day was trying to understand apprehension through comprehension. So it's like trying to understand riding a bicycle by reading the book about bicycles. But that's not the riding of the bicycle. That's not the balance. That's not the thing itself. There's a subtle difference. So we can intellectualize all we like about bicycle riding and what it means and what it feels like and how you balance. And then we can try to intellectualize balance itself. It still isn't the thing. And so that's a competency that we lack as human beings, is to be able to look at ourselves and how we construct reality directly as a phenomenon, which is using language. That's all there is to see. The fabric, the substance of what we do as human beings is made of language. It's invisible to us, but when you see it, you see it. It's undeniable. And there's nothing more to say about it. It's like, how fascinating. And it is fascinating. It can take you on some very interesting paths if you really see it and you contemplate what that means. It's a thing to see, not to understand. And so eventually some of the students started getting it. Oh, okay, I see it. And you know when they get it, because those are the ones that go quiet. And the ones that don't go quiet, that carry on intellectualizing, are the ones that aren't getting it. Eventually they all started to get it and they appreciated what it meant. And what does it mean? What is the value of seeing this? Well, here's the thing. So when we use language, how do we use language as human beings? We use it to explain things, and we use it to lift things up out of their background. So we call that creating distinctions. So if you're watching a sport, for example, a foreign sport, something you don't know, it's just a bunch of people running around. It doesn't have any meaning for you. You just see a jumble of people doing stuff. Let's say it's American football and you're not from America. And then someone would come and explain it to you. They would use language. And they would give you distinctions. When this team and this color is in a line over there and somebody from that color goes past that line, that is offsides. Okay, now I have a distinction. Now I can start to see something happening that I couldn't see before. So language enables us to lift things out of their background in a meaningful way. And we're doing that all the time. We create distinctions for our children and for each other all the time. That's how we are as human beings. Now what we're doing, when we're looking at language as a phenomenon, as a thing, we're starting to create distinctions about language. So we're elevating it by one level. We use language to create distinctions about the world, but when we can see language as a thing, as the thing that we use, as the substance, as the material, see it, not intellectualize it, then we can start to use distinctions about language. And because we are linguistic creatures, that gives us power over the way that we operate, the way that we work in the world, and makes us more effective. So you can be sitting in therapy, analyzing a theory and a story and going on and on, not ever recognizing and looking at the language that you're using and how does that tell you how you are responding to it. So my lesson for the students on the day was that I'm going to show you that humans are in one of two states, either an empowered state, taking responsibility, or a disempowered state, not taking responsibility, pushing the responsibility outwards, blaming, being in story, etc. And all of that is indicated in your language. And so you as a coach only have to listen and watch the language, and you can see instantly whether a client is approaching a theme in an empowered or disempowered way. And your job is to switch them from the disempowered relationship to the empowered. Firstly, you can see it in the language they use, spot it instantly. Secondly, by supporting them to change their language, you can help them to change their relationship to the thing. And that's what we looked at in the story. We looked at things like but and because are indicators in language that you're moving into a story in a disempowered state. If you take that away and you change it into a request with an agreement, yes or no, response that you get, that's an empowered response. I've got another video online which I've pointed to, which is around changing your language from I want to, I must, I should, to I will, or I am going to. Another way in which we can look at language, look at the language we're using directly, not complicate anything. You don't have to understand anything about the person's situation or context or their childhood or whatever. You just have to listen to their language. I sometimes coach people in very, very complex situations in industries that I know nothing about. But I can listen in their language and I can get it where they're acting in a disempowered way, and I can help switch them with that. I don't have to understand the technicalities of their business at all. I can pick it up in their language and in their way of being. There are more layers to this, but it starts, and the most effective and the highest leverage that you get is in language. And so it's difficult across this medium, me talking to you over there through a video, to hold you in that space until you get it. So you really have to do the work on your own and try to get to the point where you start to see language as a thing, language as the material that we use to create our lives as human beings. Just see it. Don't intellectualize it. And then look at it. And then go back and watch these videos and review that material and come back to this again and keep cycling through that until it becomes very, very clear for you, the aha, the penny drops, what exactly we're doing here and why we're doing it and how you can use it. That could be one of the most important things you would ever do in your life, in my experience. It will give you a command over yourself and your life that you never imagined possible. So there's nothing magic in it, and there's nothing to intellectualize about it. It's just to notice something, to recognize something that you use 100 times a day and have never named, and to develop an active relationship towards it. And that is the language that we as human beings use to create and direct our reality. So question 2 comes from episode 9, which was about word versus feelings. And it goes like this. You made the case for basing your life on your word instead of your feelings. But isn't ignoring how I feel exactly how people burn out or fake their way through a life that isn't theirs? Aren't feelings important as guides? How does what you're saying sit with the work of Beck, who says you should follow your intuitive feelings the way you would follow the spoor when you track a rhino? And so yes, this is the risk, and the skeptic is right to raise it. And importantly, you'll have heard me say that one's reaction or response should never be a binary one. Nothing I say negates the other polarity or point of view, and that's not a cop-out. It's really how things are. We tend to be very binary in our responses, and what we always need is to be seeing that it's a both and. We need to be able to integrate the paradox, use opposing information to add layers and nuance. That's always the response that we're looking for. And sometimes when we learn a new thing, we need to move towards it and embrace it fully and try it completely and then come back and put the two together. Kind of like when you learn a new craft, when you're learning to paint, you paint between the lines or draw between the lines, and then you can start breaking the rules and do the abstract stuff. But first you would want to know that you can actually do it properly. And so here's how that applies with regards to word versus feeling. And let's start at the beginning and break it down, frame by frame. The first thing we can see is that feelings are not intentional. You find yourself with them. You wake up feeling grumpy, like me, often. You can, however, set an intention. Let's say to feel enthusiastic, to feel joyful. How do you do that? Through thought, the substance of which is language. You have a conversation with yourself. And then you give your word. Now, if you just declare, I will feel better, and stand there and hope that through force of will your feelings will change, will that happen? Maybe eventually, because feelings do change, but that would be highly unreliable. And it certainly wouldn't work as an override. We're not saying you just do a cover-up feelings with new feelings, try to force them out of the way. That's the denial that leads to burnout or fakery. What can you do? Firstly, you acknowledge the existence of the feeling and the truth of the feeling, and then you act in alignment with your intention, with your word. There's plenty of research to show that your feelings fall in line when you take action. Feelings follow action. So, for example, I will go and do my morning stretches and exercises even if I don't feel like it, knowing that by the end I will feel a whole lot better and glad that I've done it, and I will start to create a bit of momentum for my day. That's done in language, it's done as a word, it's done as a commitment. I have given my word that I will do these things in the morning, and now I will do it. And so feelings exist, word intervenes, and then feeling follows. Now, if the feelings don't follow, if after doing my morning exercises, I really am feeling even worse, it's not working, It's not bringing me what it should. Then you look at that and deal with that. Maybe you have pushed yourself too far today or on other days. Maybe you are more stressed than you realize. There are times when I go to the gym, despite not feeling like it, and then I do a set or two and I just realize, you know what? I just am not there today. And then I'll stop and I'll go home. And sometimes I'll recognize that before I go to the gym. But if I'm doing that 80% of the time, I'm probably playing games with myself, making excuses. If I'm doing that as the exception, 10 or 20% of the time, probably 10% of the time or less, then it's realistic. So you're acting with intention, using feelings as information, not as instructions. So I'm not waiting for the feeling to tell me, oh, go to gym, then I might never go. But I am using the feeling as information, like today you really need to rest. Just to recap again, so how do you act with intention? You think it and ultimately speak it, internally or externally. You use language, you create a word or give your word, and then you act on that word, act in integrity with that word. And how do you use feelings as information? Well, you subordinate them to your intention, to your word. And then, if the feelings persist, you turn and consider them more seriously. And then you start using the other tools. And so intention or word is your base. And that should work for you most of the time. As I said, like 80% of the time. If you're giving into your feelings more than half the time, then you're not living on the platform of word and intention. You're living on the platform of feelings. And you might think that's working for you. It might well be up to a point. But there will be a cost. And we'll look at that when we deal with the next question. And so, yes, in the beginning, the pendulum might swing too far as you try this out. You might find that you become obsessed. Some people become incredibly judgmental and moralistic about this. I am my word, I'm being my word, and you people are not. And I know the answer. And I've seen people really get obsessed with this. Okay, that's fine up to a point. Try not to, but we might. It's like when people give up smoking, they become, zealots about it. So, push into it. Explore all its dimensions. Push it to the limits. Being your word, acting on intention. See what works and what doesn't. Get better at it. And once you've started to get a grip on it and you felt its benefits, then bring in the feelings again and give them their place, but as guides. And then you'll notice, like I said, there's times when you push yourself too hard and you should have rested. There were times when you set an intention that your intuition said wasn't right for you, but you ignored that feeling. There were times when you were set on a course, your feelings told you to change course and you ignored them. Like the tracking of the rhino. That's the whole point that Beck makes is, sometimes you lose the track of the rhino and you've got to follow your intuition, your feelings to pick it up again. The intention is the following of the rhino. The intuition is when you have to feel your way through that and decide which track to follow or which way to go to pick up the track again. And when you're doing that authentically, you're starting to use feelings as data, as information, but within a framework of intention and discipline. So the tracking of the rhino, that's the intention, the given word, your straight line. And then you respond and move according to what comes up. And what you're no longer doing in that situation is using feelings as instructions or waiting for the right feeling to get going. That's not the correct relationship to feelings. Feelings are unreliable for that. They often arise from a part of yourself that you're wanting to grow out of or grow beyond. So if you listen to them, they can take you backwards instead of forwards. And so this is not an override. It's not suppression. It's elevating the authority of intention, expressed through language, to at least equal, if not superior, to the authority of feelings in your life. And on burnout specifically, because there's a lot of that around, note that people don't burn out from keeping their word. They burn out from giving it to the wrong things, usually to look good, and never declaring what they will and won't do. The cure is more honest commitments, not fewer. And another one that relates to the theme of word and feelings, another question, flows from the previous one, and that is, I can give my word to other people and keep it, but the promises I make to myself to go to the gym, to have that early night, get up in the morning and work on that book, I'll break those constantly, and nobody knows. Why is my word to myself worth so little? So thank you for this brave and honest admission, one that is quite common, though not often confessed in the way that you have done. And first, I presume that when you say you're giving your word, that you're actually doing that, using I will or I promise with yourself as an active conversation with yourself. Presuming that, then the obvious answer to why you're not keeping your word with yourself would be that you need to respect yourself more, or how did you learn to, agreements, etc. And all of that is true, but it's only a small frame within the bigger picture. And here's what's really going on from an ontological perspective, is you're standing on the wrong platform. You're not yet standing on the platform of being your word. If you were, your word itself would mean everything to you and you'd honor it, whether it's given to yourself or to someone else. Full stop. Instead, the platform you're standing on is the platform of looking good. You're concerned with what others would think of you as a good person, as someone with integrity. And so you would feel guilt or shame or some other kind of feeling, embarrassment. And so you use the avoidance of that feeling to motivate you. And maybe you don't like to admit this, so you call it something else. I want to be there for them. I want to connect, etc. You might give yourself those reasons. But this other layer is beneath that. If you're really honest with yourself and you look, you can see it. And so here's the thing. Either you're going to get on the other platform of being your word or you're not. Either it's going to become a way of life or it's not. What would stop you is that when you start making commitments and sticking to them, it pushes up against some of your relationships. You want to do something or you've committed to something that the other person doesn't want to do. So you can't just change course. You need to stick to what you said. And so you have to say no to others. And sometimes that's the real fear. I don't want to do that to people because I'm worried about the response that I'll get, the impact it'll have on my relationship. So yes, there's a self-worth component, respecting yourself. And there's this thing of transferring our personal power to somebody else. I've done this previously in the exercise with the blue ball, giving your power away to other people. Or as we saw with the previous question, your commitments might push up against a lot of your feelings, and you're identified with being a feeling sort of person. You don't want to let that go because you don't like what you think it will make you. Maybe you had a bad experience of that in the past. You don't want to be that unfeeling person. And so I've seen some people walk right up to this information about language and being your word and honoring your word and living a life of commitment and turn it down. Their relationships and their feelings are too important for them. So it's a decision you have to make for it to become a way of life. Your feelings become subordinate to your word. That's a choice. And don't judge yourself for it. I've seen people turn this into a moral issue. Ones who take it on start judging those who don't, and those who don't feel bad or, like there's something wrong with them. In fact, I was probably that person for a while, making the judgments against people who don't take this on as a way of life. I don't support that. You take this on because you see it for what it is, a source of personal power, a way of improving your personal effectiveness, as a commitment to a way of being. You must have your own reasons for it. You can't force it any more than you can force yourself to be pregnant without doing the deed. It's a choice, and you have to make that choice of what platform you're going to stand on what platform you're going to base your life on. Feelings or word? Which one is primary and which is secondary? Well, actually, that's technically incorrect. Word is either primary or it's nowhere. In other words, if you live a life based on feelings, then you would only keep your word if you feel like it, which means there is no being your word, standing on your word, honoring your word, having integrity. It's all based on feelings. Whereas if word is primary, then feelings can still be there at a close second. You can allow feelings to influence the way that you keep your commitments. So you can have word and feelings if word is primary. If word is not primary, you only have feelings to base your life on. And that's the whole of the matter. Question 4 relates to episode 10, which is around story versus reality. I hear you on the stories thing, but in my case, the story is the reality. My boss genuinely is undermining me, and I've got the emails to prove it. So how does the story versus reality distinction apply when you're actually right? And I had this come up in my leadership lecture as well, by the way, in a different form. Someone who uses narrative coaching as a model. How do you know when you're supporting your client in their story and their narrative or not? And the same principles apply. And so the check question is, Your friends might agree with your story, and they probably will. That's what friends do. But would, say, a judge or an arbiter who was brought in to adjudicate the situation, your friends are not the right person to check this with. So what you need to do is imagine someone, that arbiter or judge, disagreeing with your story. How would you feel? And there's your test. Because a fact you can live with. It's raining. It's Tuesday. Those are facts. It's your story about the fact that makes it hard to deal with. It's raining and I want to play outside. It's Tuesday and he or she still hasn't called. And when you resist an opposing view, that's the indicator that you're holding your story as the truth, rather than just as the interpretation that it is. And that's why this is a useful example, because if you were, say, to take this to HR or to an arbiter, and you started using the word undermining, they wouldn't let you. They would say, no, you can't, that's not proof of undermining. You don't know what their motive is. You need to state the facts. Just state the facts, and then we will determine whether you have a verifiable story or not. And so it's a good discipline to do this, to see where the boundary is between what are the facts and what is your story. And it's not to say that there isn't a truth, that there isn't undermining going on, but it helps you to recognize the difference between what is real and what is your story. Because it's the holding on to the story as the truth that reduces our options and our ability to act in an empowered way. Because let's say in this situation, I do really recognize that undermining is my story. I don't really know what's going on inside that person's head, the boss's head. Don't really know why they're doing it. It looks for all the world to me like they're undermining. But if I had to sit and ask them, they would probably have a different story. They're trying to teach you something. They don't think you're ready. They think your time is up. Or they're just busy. Something different. If you were to interview them, something would come up out of that. Some intention would arise that you were not aware of. And that would be their story. Now it's your story versus their story. And that's where we get stuck. So to try to assert your story as the truth is where we get confused between what's real and what's not. Your story may be true. It certainly feels true. It's an experience of it being true. Now, when you sit with the possibility, and this isn't to jump to conclusions about what it means, this is a thing that we're not used to doing either, to sit with the possibility of a thing, to sit in the truth of the matter, then new things arise from within, things you wouldn't have considered before. Because when you're stuck that your story is the truth, you keep coming to the same conclusions. This person is wrong, they are bad, they must change their behavior, I deserve this, etc. You can't change that. But when you come to the fact that this is just an interpretation and you sit with that quietly, just the fact, undisturbed, new possibilities arise. It's specific language we're using. New possibilities arise from that space, that mental context, that freed up mental context that you have. You might see something that you don't like. I don't like the fact that maybe he is teaching me something. Maybe I wasn't, justified in doing X, Y, Z. Maybe I'm not up to the job. Maybe I've got things to learn. We don't like that stuff. We'd rather have our story. So those are possibilities. They might come up. And then you might say, okay, maybe I can adjust my story a little bit here. Maybe, can you see what's happening? It's shifting responsibility back to you. And it's activating a range of choices. Okay, I could try this, I could try that. That's what's really going on there. When we stop treating story as fact. And you might decide, after having done that no, I deserve to be treated better, or I don't want this experience, whether it's that reason or this reason or whatever, I just don't want this experience. You're free to make that choice too. But it would be an empowered choice. You would probably do something like go and find another job, or go and make a request to your boss, or something. Or you might decide to live with it. You might say, okay, I can see that, this isn't really fair and I don't really like it, but there are some reasons and anyway, I need this job, so I'm going to live with it. That's also an empowered choice. The key here is that you are actively choosing and you're not stuck confusing your story with an absolute truth, with the truth. And that loosens up possibility and puts you in touch with what's real and what matters. And that's the whole objective of what we're doing here. And so it's the same, the person who asked me in the class around narrative coaching. You're using someone's story to help them understand themselves. Great. But to what extent are they treating their story as the truth and holding on to it as the truth? And I am suffering because this, and not letting go of that, as against using it to understand and broaden their perspective. Oh, I see that that person had this understanding, this motive, and loosening up your interpretation of it so that you can reinterpret your story and use your story in an empowering way to move forward rather than use it as something to blame and shift responsibility outwards onto. And that's the key distinction that we're looking to get here. Dealing with what's real, what matters, taking responsibility, decisions and actions, as against being lost in story and going around in circles. Question 5 relates to episode 11 and the theme of listening. How does your listening framework differ from the more traditional psychological framing of one's point of view or perception being a lens that you see the world through? Is it the same thing, just sounding clever? My response is yes, it's essentially the same phenomenon, but no, it's not just the same thing sounding clever. It addresses that phenomenon more directly as it's happening. You can see this is what we're always on about, is looking at things directly as they are, as a phenomenon, not intellectually. And so the approach of listening does that, and it says something that the lens metaphor doesn't. And here's the difference. A lens is kind of neutral and static. It's a filter you look through. It explains that you don't see the world in its raw form, but the lens interpretation is silent on why you see what you see. Listening is a much stronger and clearer claim. And that is that your perception isn't just filtered. It's committed, we could say. You're always and already listening, and you're listening for something specific, as illustrated by the fact that if somebody says your name, you hear it. No matter how busy you are or how much noise there is in the room, someone says your name, you'll hear it. So you're already listening, already committed to hearing and listening for what matters to you. So that's not a lens. That's you. That's your orientation, already awake. Listening for what touches your concerns, your name, your reputation, the people you love, the thing you're worried about. So we don't perceive from a neutral filter. We listen from our concerns. We make meaning out of what we hear based on how it lands on what we care about. Always. And that's the real difference. It's catchable. A lens is something you theorize about. But your listening you can catch in the act, because thinking is itself a kind of listening, a voice in your head that runs while you listen to the sounds in the room. You don't need a book or a theory to find it. It's happening right now in front of you. Well, inside your head. So it's not clever language for the same idea. It's a more accurate, more immediate, and it puts you in direct relationship with the thing itself, which is the whole point of what we do here. Ontology, the science of being. So it's something to see, not something to intellectualize. And finally, question 6, also to do with listening from episode 11. The work of changing my listening sounds very enlightened or woke, just like more overblown empathy. If I just shift my listening, aren't I just letting people off the hook, excusing bad behavior by choosing to hear it more generously? And so in this question, the positioning and the use of the word bad, excusing bad behavior, reveals your listening frame already in place. What bad behavior are you already listening for? Because if you're listening for it, you'll find it, even when it's not there. And I'm sure you hate it when that happens to you, like when some political opponent won't hear your point of view. There it is in reverse. The fact is, other people's internal processes are not directly accessible to you, just as your internal thoughts are not directly accessible to them. So you can assume about them, or you can ask. If you ask, and you're already listening for something, then are you really asking? Or are you just leading them into a trap? We tend to see ourselves primarily in the light of our intentions, which are invisible to others, but we assess others mainly in the light of their actions, which are visible to us. Or stated differently, we attribute motive based on observed behavior, but we explain ourselves in terms of our intentions. So someone is doing something not participating in a meeting, for example, and you think they're being lazy or grumpy. But if you ask them, they would explain, no, actually, my dog is sick. And the same goes for you. So we want that from others, for people to examine our intention, so we should grant it to them. And what does that look like? Well, what if you listen for the other person's reasoning, their judgment, etc., as pure information before you make any assessments? If you did that, then you would ask more questions and you would get more information. And then if there was bad behavior, it would reveal itself in the context. There's a brilliant series on Apple TV called The Chair Company, in which a guy sits on a chair in a presentation and it collapses. And it's an interesting take on corporate culture, on conspiracy theories, but also on corporate HR. Because when he falls, one of the things that happens is he sees up this lady's dress. And then she says, well, I'm not going to make a thing of it, but I am going to make a thing of it. And so she reports it. And then they start investigating him, whether he might be a predator. And of course, they can find all kinds of evidence in his background that could indicate that there was something going on, because he has a photograph of him doing this when he was 15 or whatever it happens to be. So their listening is that the behavior was bad, and they start to find evidence for it. There's a counterpoint to that, which is in the movie called In the Hand of Dante. And here's a spoiler. It doesn't really spoil the theme of the movie. It's just one scene that's kind of a little cameo. And this kid comes home to his uncle, and the uncle is played by Al Pacino, and it's one of the most brilliant scenes. And the kid says, hello, Unc. Hey, kid, how you doing? And he says, I killed the boy. He says, what? And he says, what is he doing? Oh, he pulled a knife on me. I slit his throat. Okay. Now in this one, the uncle's listening is magnificent, because he asks the kid questions. Well, are you going to make a career out of this? The kid says, no, it's just something that happened. And then they go into, should I make a confession and all of this? And he guides the kid. So instead of assuming that the kid is bad and he's now going to turn into a killer and he must get punished and spend his life in jail, he assesses the kid's motive and analyzes it from an opening listening stance. And he makes a completely different choice. And so those are two brilliant illustrations of the impact of our listening. So you listen first, and if bad emerges, you deal with it. If it doesn't, you don't. And so this isn't about being compassionate or generous. It's about being accurate, dealing with what's real and what matters. It's not about being soft for the sake of soft or nice for the sake of nice. It's about actually being fair, actually being open, actually dealing with what's real and what matters. And so thank you. So that's what to believe for this week. If you're finding value from this, please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and share. I'm Neil Beerbaum. Thank you for listening. See you next time.